Now my right hand held the second corner of the tarpaulin aloft on a paddle handle, and my right foot cleated the sheets. My left foot stepped to the mast, and finally my left hand was free to hold the rudder and steady the canoe downwind. The wind bellowed a steady gale right into my square sail, filling it entirely, and the canoe lunged straight and true down the lawn. I was under sail.
Any better?
Yes.
Yeah. Nice.
If I were going to give one definition of what a producer does, an audio producer, but also a producer of any kind, it would be solve problems that are unpredictable.
Yep.
Solve unpredictable problems related to audio production, editorial reporting, using creativity and an understanding of basic principles at work, and not according to a set of protocols, because there's no particular protocol.
I mean, that is also what you do all day long if you're canoeing the Northern Forest Canoe Trail. It's just like, solve whatever problems come up.
Okay, well, Justin Reich, welcome back to Upper Middlebrow. So tell us where you are, and remind it what day. Today is May 31st, 2025, in the Common Era, in the year of our Lord, if you're practicing. Where are you?
I am in Stratton, Maine, which is a town on the very southwest corner of Flagstaff Lake. And Flagstaff Lake, it has a hydropower dam in the northeast corner, and the power company owns all the land up to 4 feet above the typical lake height and makes it all available for recreation.
If I'm okay, I'm looking at the map. If I remember correctly, if one is hiking the Bigelows, one can either start that at the AT crossing near Stratton, or at the other side of Flagstaff Lake at the Little Bigelow Trailhead. And as I recall, there's like a road, like a kind of like a logging road that goes there, and then sort of terminates. Or actually, according to this, it goes along the lake for a good long way.
Yeah, if you're hiking along the Appalachian Trail, sort of southbound from Katahdin, you will touch the very southeast corner of Flagstaff Lake as you're going around. The Bigelow Range, Flagstaff Lake runs east to west, and the Bigelow Range stretches across that. And Stratton is actually something like 8 miles off of the trail proper.
Yep.
But it's got a sort of side trail that comes down off the Bigelows, and then another way that you can kind of get back onto it, because it's a resupply town. And,
it's a big trail town, as I recall. Like, there's hostels there, and is that where the Pie Lady is, or is that some other Maine town?
I didn't see a Pie Lady, but when I got off the south branch of the Dead River, and I could either paddle into town or walk into town, and for various reasons I decided to walk into town because it made me a little bit more flexible trying to find a place to stay. I walked like 300 yards, and there was a guy who had a pop-up bakery on his front porch that was selling strawberry rhubarb cookies, chocolate chip cookies, and sourdough coffee cake muffins, and I bought one of each.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the Pie Lady Sidney Pratt in Monson, Maine, which I think is farther north along the way.
Monson is also where Shaw's is, which might be the best hostel and breakfast on the Appalachian Trail, certainly in the Northeast.
And it's been raining a lot lately. You and I talked very briefly prior to this. Tell the listeners how you got to Stratton.
So there had actually been kind of a sunny, it had rained a whole bunch for a bunch of days, and I needed to get from the Rangeley Lakes in the town of Rangeley. So you go into Umbagog Lake, and then up the Richardson's Lake, and then up Mooslemugunticook, and then across Rangeley Lake to the town of Rangeley. And the south branch of the Dead River, unlike many of the rivers in Maine, is known as creeky or flashy,
right?
Which means that it only runs when there's snowmelt or there's rain.
Yep.
It is not a reliable place to paddle. However, on the Northern Forest Canoe Trail, it is the only waterway that connects Rangeley and Stratton, which are about 20 miles apart. So if the water's not running, you have to walk along the road, and there's logging trucks, and it's also just not that. It's kind of fun to walk with a canoe, but it's really not that fun to walk with a canoe.
You're not out there to walk with a canoe. I mean,
You're not out there to
you're
walk
going to
with a
do a
canoe.
lot of that, but that's not the point of this.
No, the point of this is to try to get down some whitewater rivers, and it was supposed to rain all morning this morning, and so even though I got into Rangeley 2 nights ago, I was like, I'm going to take a rest day in Rangeley, and I'm going to let it rain all morning on Saturday morning, and then I'm going to leave when it stops raining around noon, and I'm going to hike the 3 miles to the put-in. You got to portage 3 miles, sort of go over a watershed. And I was just hoping against all hope, or with all hope, that the river would be high enough to paddle. And I walked up there, and it was deep enough to get my paddle in. And so I hopped in and had a great, I don't know what it's 18 or 20 miles of whitewater, really at a nice level. I guess at really high levels, the South Branch of the Dead River can be pretty challenging, and there can be some things you need to get out and scout or line or things like that. But I was able to just read and run the whole thing.
Yes.
Which was good because I started late.
It is good. I am remembering, and you started late because it was raining. I'm remembering that our friend Mike and our friend Hans, many years ago, I think in a fall, like October, after maybe like a rainy week, checked and saw that the Dead River was runnable. And Doug, who is an excellent river canoeist, was in a solo boat, and Mike and Hans, who were not very skilled river canoeists, were in a separate tandem boat, and I believe they had a hairy, scary experience of flipping and then being rescued by Doug. And I think Mike was frustrated about that because he doesn't like to be put in situations sort of beyond his skill level, sort of felt like it was not a good idea all around, that the parties involved had undersold the challenge of the situation. But, they're all still alive and thriving, so it all worked out.
Well, the guidebook author, it's funny about the maps and the guidebooks. There was a guy I talked to, we mentioned him last time, the guy Steve at the St. Regis canoe, sort of St. Regis outfitter, who said to me something like, look, the maps, the guides, they record the river at a certain water level.
Yep.
But the water levels are always changing.
Yep. That makes sense.
So a lot of the guidance for the South Branch is like, there are these 2 really hairy rapids. You really, you might not want to do that section. If you do that section, you really shouldn't do it with loaded boats. You really should plan on portaging or lining or bushwhacking. And I'm sure that's true at certain water levels, but on May 31st of 2025, it was fine. It was technically challenging, and have to be reasonably proficient, but there was it was not the hardest stretch of whitewater that I've done on the trip, but it was certainly amongst the loveliest. It was, and it kind of alternated between what I think of as the canonical main river of these deep, dark spruces, these wonderful smells, big granite sidewalls periodically coming up. But for whatever reason, somewhere in the middle there, the landscape flattened way out, and it was birches and deciduous trees and became much lighter and airier. Actually, the sun came out at that point for a little bit. And then it was kind of back into the spruce moose forest.
Your setting is reminding me of an interesting bit of trivia. Actually, and I don't know if you know this, but Loretta Swit, the actress who played Margaret Houlihan in the MASH TV show, died
who
a
just
couple days
passed
ago.
away.
Yeah, she was 87, so nice long life. But I was a big fan of that show, as was most of America in the 1970s and 80s. So MASH was based on a novel written by a guy named Richard Hornberger. His pseudonym was Richard Hooker. And one of the things I noticed in watching MASH as an adult is that a lot of the characters are named after places in Maine. So there's a character named Daniel Penobscot. I think there are a few other examples, but then one of the nurses is Nurse Bigelow. And in fact, the nurses are named Nurse Abel, Nurse Baker, which are sort of like classic army shortenings of A and B, and then Nurse Bigelow. And I believe that Nurse Bigelow was portly too.
Did you say Abel?
Nurse Abel and Nurse Baker.
I mean, Abel is Abel Bridge, just south of Katahdin.
Oh, well, there you go. And is there a baker in Maine?
I mean, there must
But also
be, yeah.
Able. I think often companies, Able Company,
Yeah.
Baker Company, Charlie Company. I think that's kind of like one version of the phonetic alphabet too. So anyway, because I recall when you're in Flagstaff Lake, you can see the Bigelow Range the entire time
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
on
it's
the
right
lake,
there.
and it's stunning
Yeah.
and beautiful. Well, Justin, you sent something in the mail. I hadn't seen it the last time we talked, but I have received it, and I have decided that I am going to read it aloud for the Upper Middle Brow listeners.
Excellent.
Will you tell me what it is that they are about to hear read aloud?
Yes, I just a couple days of the trip into the trip, which was now a few weeks ago, I was able to do one of my very favorite things in the world, which is rig up a canoe for sailing. And I decided I had to write you extensively about it, both because it was so enjoyable, but because you had identified a crucial defect in one of my pieces of gear that I did not fix, that I just went out into the world with. And this defect was a very serious problem for its originally intended purpose, but turned out to be exceptionally useful for canoe sailing.
Well, and I think so a liability was converted into an asset.
Yes.
We can let the listener discover.
That's one of the 7 stories, I think. A liability becomes an asset.
Yes, one of Plato's 7 stories, or Aristotle's 7 stories. Liability becomes an asset. I think another one is a man goes into the wilderness and survives a perilous journey. So you've got 2 of them here at least. Will you say something about the account is written in a very specific style, I would say.
I'll say 2. I can give you the when I was first thinking of it, it just, I don't know, the story kind of made me think of Master and Commander, which I know is something that Patrick O'Brien novels about, sort of nautical sailing, that I know you've wanted to try to convince Chris to read with you. But I was in the midst of reading Dracula and Frankenstein and A Study in Scarlet, and I think that language sort of took over more, as I was going along.
I would say so, yes. Very much so, but in a way that I find entertaining. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I give you the contemporary Victorian epistolary short travel nonfiction by author Justin Reich. My dear Mr. Dukes, I hope this too long missive finds you hale and hearty on the Pacific waters as spring turns to summer. For my own part, I have developed a rather exciting innovation in nautical conveyance, which I now feel obliged to convey to you as I make my way down east from the Adirondacks to Fort Kent. I thought of you as I developed this innovation because some weeks ago you identified a flaw, a very genuine imperfection in my kit, and while I must concede this flaw is indeed an impediment for its originally intended purpose, it has proved a true boon for an alternative means of locomotion, or navimotion, as it were. It would perhaps be faster to assign these thoughts to you by telegraph or some other electronic means of communication, but my diatribe requires certain diagrams and annotations that I think best inscribed by hand. I set these words first to you for the reasons I have already alluded to, but if you find these remarks worthy, I hope you will share them with our intimates. I believe you know that for some 30-plus years I have enjoyed, studied, and practiced the dark arts of canoe sailing, although if memory serves, you and I have not had the pleasure of traveling together in such a manner. You are no doubt well acquainted with the typical manner by which a group, or perhaps better said, a raft of canoes might together hoist a sail. But nonetheless, let me describe the typical operation of canoe sailing so that we may establish common terms, shared idiom, and a lingua franca for the domain. For this exercise in ground setting, or perhaps more aptly pond setting, let us assume a raft of 4 canoes illustrated and labeled below. Nota bene. The author has drawn 2 crude illustrations, which we will include in the show notes. In the A position, the savvy raft captain will place his tallest lad or lasses. A sailor must affix one corner of a tarpaulin to the handle of a paddle and hoist the sail as high as possible. The blade of the paddle may be set in the divot made by the bow handle or reefed by being set lower between the legs. For the B position, it is crucial to select a crew of cheery disposition, ideally small ones. The Bs will suffer greatly while others enjoy the sail. It is the sole task of the Bs to hold the raft together and duck down. In some trimmings of the sail, the tarpaulin will be afore the Bs, and it will merely block their vision. In my experience, however, it is quite common for the bees to be forced to duck under the sail, perhaps for hours at a stretch. I find it best to force the bees to paddle in harsh conditions for many hours before sailing, so even these unfortunate conditions appear favorable by comparison. Nota bene. The author is referring to our shared experience of being camp counselors and wilderness trip leaders. The C's main task is to hold the sheets tied from the bottom corner of the tarpaulin. By keeping the bottom of the sail curled back, a suitable shape can be obtained for running downwind. The D's captain the whole raft, steering with their rudders. I have passed fine afternoons in such a configuration, sailing due east across Flagstaff with stout Chewonki lads, and north on Long Lake in the Allagash, sailing with my own family and that of Brigadier General Nelson. Ricard. 2 comments upon this operation are still necessary. First, conditions for a good sail are narrow and ephemeral. Indeed, discovering such conditions is one of the joys of the enterprise. One needs a lake of some length, and the wind must blow steadily in the desired direction. The raft can primarily run downwind. With a very skilled captain and crew, one can reach a bit to either direction, but a beam reach or pointing are out of the question. Thus, the winds must be steady enough and the lake long enough to merit the time and trouble of setting down paddles and arranging the rigging. A second point is that the typical rigging configuration I have described requires at least 5 hands: to hoist the masts and sails, to hoist the sheets, and at least 1 rudder must be set in the water to steer the course. This constraint will prove the mother of invention in only a few lines. With that established, let me take the narrative to the 12th of May, on the 3rd day of my expedition on Long Lake, north and east of Old Forge in the Adirondacks. Few places are better named for launching an expedition than Old Forge. Men to be forged by expedition. I awoke, to my great delight, to a completely calm morning, with a surface of sheer glass upon the lake. Long Lake sits like a huge, swollen long member upon the land, thrusting itself towards the Rocket River. Nota bene, I do believe the author intended the prior sentence as a crude attempt at what Shakespeare would call a bawdy quibble. It stretches for 12 miles, but I had camped perhaps 2 miles in. I took delight at the calm because for the prior 2 days, winds had come out of the north, which if repeated on this day would have made for tough going. I broke camp and headed north. The lake was still, and I passed the hours observing the beauty around me. For instance, the Adirondack shores are lined with fulsome cedar trees. The coniferous leaves sprout in every direction. But all along the lakefront, the bottom 5 feet of the trees are completely bare, to an even height. The effect is an almost perfectly straight cut along the whole of the shore. While one might surmise the deficit of lower leaves is caused by the lack of light or some other feature of the cedar itself, in fact, the leaves are browsed to an even height by the local deer. How droll that the gardener should send his foremen and workers to these shores to effect such careful scraping of the land. Nota bene, gardener is spelled with a capital G. The divine order of this place is enough to get all the atheists with their undies in a bunch. There I was, pondering these thoughts, or perhaps even shouting them aloud to the empty lake like a raving lunatic, when a wind picked up, and the waves took up a small swell. I shuddered. A north wind with some 4 miles left would be cumbersome indeed. But my hat tipped forward, and I realized the zephyr in a majestic kindness had brought gusts from the south, and not just any wind, but one moderate and strikingly steady. After a few minutes' calculation, I determined that an attempt to sail was warranted. I should be very ashamed to describe to you my first feeble efforts. I must apologize in advance to the droplets of ink in my well that will spend eternity recording these fruitless efforts. I removed my small tarpaulin, 6 feet by 4 feet, large enough to barely cover my frame in a pinch. I clove-hitched the top corners of the tarpaulin to 2 paddle handles, and then ran the line down to a hitch just above the blade. With each hand, I hoisted the paddles while cleating the sheets with my feet. Recall some lines ago I mentioned that a canoe rigged with a square sail requires 5 hands, and the single rig I have just described requires both my hands and feet. No appendages could be spared for a rudder. I could hoist my sail, but the nose of the boat would drift astride the wind, causing my direction to head towards one shore or another. Tacking downwind in this fashion must have been a very sorry sight, and you have my sincere apologies for putting such an embarrassing image of your dear friend in your mind. Nota bene, in fact, I rather enjoy that image. I was casting about my small hull looking for something that might help affix a sail above the boat when my eyes alit upon the pole I had constructed with Brigadier General Nelson. Having mentioned B.G. Nelson twice, it is necessary to remember that while he spent most of his career as Brigadier General 3 stars, he was subsequently promoted to Brigadier General 4 stars. To my knowledge, he is the only officer to hold this particular rank, and the only one promoted to this rank by the dearly missed Cheryl Adele Blair. May God hold her soul in the light and watch over her progeny on earth. Nota bene, Cheryl Adele Blair is the author's mother. The pole. As you recall, the 12-foot aluminum pole is in 2 halves. One is 6 foot, and the other is 6 foot with a narrow or 9-inch shaft extending from the base. The poles are conjoined by thrusting the 9-inch shaft into the hole on the other pole in the manner that God intended. The snap lock mechanism that holds the pole in place is entirely human artifice and not to be recommended for non-metallic conjoinings. Nota bene, I do believe the author once again intends a Bowdy snippet. As you no doubt recall, on the far end of the pole is affixed a 3/8-inch bolt extending for 3 inches. As you noted, such a narrow tip is perhaps imperfect for poling upriver, where a wider interface with the riverbed might be desirable. However, the great sailor be praised, my tarpaulin had corner grommets just wide enough for such a bolt. I had a mast at hand. How, then, to rig it? Below, I inscribe a schematic of my center thwart and portage yoke. Recall that since I travel alone, I sit reversed in the stern, facing the yoke. As you suggested, my yoke has a length of parachute cord square lashed across. I swear upon my honor and candor that if the Polynesians had mastered the art of kern mantle construction of polyethylene-lined rope in their time, we would all be wearing grass skirts and worshipping Maui. Nota bene, I believe the author is now making a racially insensitive joke, perhaps to get into the spirit of the Victorian writing style that he is satirizing. The square lash is the same as taught by Messrs. Shute, Riley, and Hennen, and Mesdames Zeminski, Sullivan, and Quimby, and all of these fine teachers of the old ways, the true ways. Nota bene, the author refers to colleagues of ours at the summer camp where we used to work. I affixed one corner of the tarpaulin to the mast and threaded the bottom of the pole through the left lashing which held it affixed to the thwart. With my left foot, I could apply counter-pressure to the bottom of the mast to counter the forces of the wind at the top. Thus did I hoist the sail and free one of my hands. The pole bottom scratched at the hull as it slid around, so I cast it about for a mast step. On my foot, I wore the adjustable Crocs that I acquired with you so near to the surfing mecca of Doho. Nota bene, the author is referring to rubber clog-style shoes purchased in the town of San Clemente. I don't know if they are actually the name brand Crocs or a generic shoe made in the Croc style. I removed the crock, and the instep of the crock bit the mast bottom while the sole of the crock held fast to the hull. Now my right hand held the second corner of the tarpaulin aloft on a paddle handle, and my right foot cleated the sheets. My left foot stepped to the mast, and finally my left hand was free to hold the rudder and steady the canoe downwind. The wind bellowed a steady gale right into my square sail, filling it entirely, and the canoe lunged straight and true down the long. I was under sail. Should Leif Erikson himself had seen the craft gliding upon the lake, he would be forced to pause his pillaging, pour out a few drops of mead, and declare, "That is some real Viking shit," though in old Norwegian. Nota bene, another diagram follows. Since you have a great familiarity with sums and figures, you have no doubt intuited my next problem. As I said, the sail was 4 feet high, hoisted on a 6-foot pole. The canoe hole was about 2 feet deep. Thus, at full sail, the tarpaulin completely and entirely blocked my vision. I raced down the lake without the slightest sense of what lay ahead. Madame Helen Keller herself could have taken the helm without losing an iota or a monad of navigational efficiency. Indeed, Ms. Keller's experience with blind navigation might have given her some advantage over me, although I gather that the madam is currently indisposed, and such a test will never come to be. Nota bene, I believe the author is making both an ableist joke and a death joke in one fell swoop. As I raced down the lake, I satisfied myself with following the shoreline as a reference point, occasionally using Captain Ramius's Crazy Ivan maneuver to check not astern for enemies, but for rocks ahead. Thus did I become a solo canoe sailor. Since Long Lake, I have sailed twice more, each time improving the rigging. On Union Pond in the lower Saranac, I reasoned that if one is good, 2 are better, and raised the tarpaulin using both poles as masts, one on each side of the yoke. Thus, each foot stepped one mast, and my hands were free to steer the rudder and handle the sheets. I took another sail on Lake Champlain towards North Harrow, in the shadow of Mansfield and Camel's Hump. Here the wind lightened, and I wished my hands could be entirely free of the rigging to paddle and sail simultaneously. I needed a heavy object to clamp down on the lines, and I'm sure you realize that I find myself, the fat bowman, always in possession of such a mass. Nota bene, here the author makes a fat joke, albeit on himself. Thus was the butt cleat invented, completing my innovations in hands-free sailing. I could recount to you many other tales from the river, from wave trains that would have given our good friend Scary Larry a run for his money. Nota bene, Scary Larry is a rapid local to Barnard, Vermont, where the author keeps a home. To the many others, eagles, beavers, and loons that have been my constant companions. Per your sage advice, at least once a day I summon that wizened teacher Merlin to acquaint myself with the local ornithology. Should you find this narrative suitable, I hope you will make photostatic or photographic copies to send to our intimates, Brigadier General Nelson, kindly Coach Bagg, and the great and good Dean Professor Olivetti, who might see fit to read this to our issue. If you can find his laudanum Dropbox, you might also dash off a copy to that inimitable rascal, Herr Chongo. Nota bene, here the author makes an inside joke that would probably double the narrative if I were to explain it. I have shared with you these tales of mirth and gaiety as befits our correspondence, though of course long hours of solitary travel find every emotion, sadness, loneliness, raving lunacy, fear of imminent death, and the sublime. Nota bene, the author does use the Oxford comma here, thus making it clear that he is not afraid of both death and the sublime, but that fear of imminent death, comma, and the sublime are 2 separate categories. Many times, however, I take great cheer and comfort in recalling the virtues of our long, fine friendship, and the love and camaraderie we share with our intimates. With that, I am ever yours truly, Captain Blair Justin Fire Reich. Postscript, as Pascal answered, if I had more time, this letter might be half as long. Still, I have identified I don't know what this word is, concise term for the genre, contemporary Victorian epistolary short travel non-fiction. And here is another diagram of the 2-mast canoe sail. You have been listening to Upper Middlebrow. Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes hold the raft together while steering the course. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and today's contributor, Justin Reich. Find us on Patreon, where there are a number of tiers at which you could show your support. And a reminder, Bagg and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, editing, or contemporary Victorian epistolary short travel nonfiction project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com.